They mocked my ugly concrete wall, fined me for ruining the neighborhood aesthetic, and told everyone I was paranoid about a river that hadn't flooded in decades. Then the storm came, the water rose, and in one single night $2.4 million worth of homes were swallowed while my house stood dry behind the very barrier they tried to tear down. If you love stories where arrogance meets reality and reality wins, subscribe now and stay with me, because this one doesn't just end in vindication, it ends in consequences no HOA board saw coming. When I bought the smallest house on the edge of the subdivision, the realtor described the narrow strip of trees behind it as charming natural scenery, but I grew up 3 counties over and I recognized the bend of that river immediately, the way it curved deceptively calm before narrowing downstream, the kind of geography that turns a steady rain into a funnel. And while the HOA brochures bragged about elevated modern living and premium flood-safe zoning, I did my own homework, digging into historical floodplain maps, county drainage studies, and archived satellite images from 20 years earlier that showed faint water scars creeping farther inland than anyone admitted. And the more I researched, the more I realized the developers had gambled on mild weather patterns holding forever. So before I even unpacked half my boxes, I met with a structural engineer and a contractor about building a reinforced concrete flood wall along the rear property line. Not some decorative garden barrier but a properly footed, rebar-laced, 4-foot-high wall anchored deep enough to resist hydrostatic pressure. And when the HOA Architectural Committee saw the plans, they laughed in that polite suburban way that hides condescension behind smiles, telling me it was unnecessary, unsightly, and not in harmony with the community's open aesthetic. But I pushed forward because the covenants allowed protective structures with proper permits, and I had both permits and stamped engineering drawings, so they couldn't legally deny it, though that didn't stop them from sending violation notices about color inconsistency and visual obstruction. And when the wall went up, smooth gray concrete stretching cleanly across my back line, the comments began, neighbors joking during evening walks about my border checkpoint, kids calling it the prison wall. And at the next HOA meeting the president actually projected a photo of my yard onto a screen and asked whether anyone else felt property values might suffer because of unnecessary fortifications, and I stood there, hands folded, explaining calmly that water doesn't care about aesthetics, that prevention looks excessive until the day it isn't, and they voted to fine me $200 for failing to repaint it an approved neutral tone despite the fact that bare concrete was structurally recommended. So I paid the fine without argument, because sometimes the smartest revenge is patience. And for 2 years nothing happened beyond mild storms and smug comments, and I almost began to doubt myself, until that August when meteorologists started tracking a stalled tropical system pushing inland, feeding off humid air and dumping rain in bands that circled back over the same counties for days, and the ground saturated quickly, storm drains overflowed, and the river behind our subdivision swelled from a quiet ribbon into a churning brown wall. And on the 3rd night of rain I stood on my patio with a flashlight watching the water level creep toward the tree line, calculating rise rates against the wall height I'd chosen, while my phone buzzed with HOA emails assuring residents that municipal drainage systems are performing as designed, but by dawn the municipal drainage system was irrelevant. Because the river had breached its banks entirely, pouring into the low-lying greenbelt behind the houses like a bathtub spilling over, and I watched as water rushed toward the rear fences of my neighbors' manicured lawns, first pooling gently, then climbing inches per hour. And I won't pretend I felt pure sympathy in that first moment, because there was a sharp edge of vindication as the flood hit my wall and split, sliding sideways along the reinforced surface instead of surging into my yard, and I walked the perimeter checking for seepage while across the barrier I heard shouting, car alarms, the hollow splash of patio furniture floating loose, and by mid-morning the houses directly behind mine were taking water through their sliding doors, drywall soaking like sponges, hardwood floors buckling, and the irony was brutal. The very openness the HOA prized became a channel for destruction, because without barriers the water equalized quickly across properties, and emergency crews arrived by boat in what used to be driveways, evacuating families through second-story windows while I stood on dry ground offering extension cords for generators, and by the time the rain finally tapered off 2 days later, 8 homes had sustained catastrophic interior flooding, insurance adjusters estimating combined damages at roughly $2.4 million. And that number became the headline in local news coverage that featured aerial footage clearly showing one solitary yard untouched behind a gray concrete line. And suddenly my ugly wall was the only thing anyone wanted to talk about, reporters knocking on my door asking why I built it, neighbors who had mocked me now studying the structure with narrowed eyes, and the HOA board convened an emergency meeting not to apologize but to discuss whether my wall had diverted natural flow and contributed to adjacent damage, which might have infuriated me if it hadn't been so predictable, because institutions that cling to image rarely accept fault gracefully, and that accusation triggered the first twist, since I had anticipated it and commissioned a hydrology assessment during construction that modeled overflow scenarios demonstrating the wall would not increase downstream flood heights but merely shield my parcel from lateral incursion, and when the board hinted at legal action, my attorney presented that report along with photographic evidence showing water levels equal on both sides of the wall during peak flow, proving it acted as a passive barrier rather than a dam, and the HOA's tone shifted again from accusation to cautious curiosity. But the real twist came weeks later when a civil engineer hired by one of the flooded homeowners discovered something far more explosive. During original development, the builder had removed a natural berm along the riverbank to create flatter, more marketable backyards, effectively lowering the subdivision's natural defense by nearly 18 inches, and internal emails surfaced revealing the HOA had been warned years earlier about the increased flood risk but chose not to pursue additional mitigation because it might alarm buyers, and when that information became public during insurance disputes, anger redirected sharply away from my wall and toward the board members who had dismissed risk in favor of curb appeal, and lawsuits began, not against me, but against the developer and the HOA for failure to disclose known vulnerabilities, and I was subpoenaed to testify about my independent research, presenting archived floodplain data that predated my purchase, and sitting in that deposition room I realized something profound. The wall had not only protected my home, it had preserved documentation that others had ignored, and as legal costs mounted, several board members resigned, replaced by residents demanding infrastructure upgrades rather than aesthetic policing, and the HOA, once obsessed with uniform mailboxes and approved paint swatches, voted to allocate reserves toward communal flood mitigation measures including reinforced embankments and updated drainage culverts, essentially implementing the very precautions they once ridiculed. And there was a moment months later, after repairs finished and families moved back into renovated homes, when one neighbor approached me quietly and admitted she'd laughed the loudest at the meeting where my wall was mocked, and she thanked me, not just for the example but for encouraging the new board to adopt smarter planning. And I told her I never wanted anyone to lose their floors or heirlooms just to prove a point, but sometimes proof arrives in the form of water, undeniable and expensive, and the final twist came at the next annual property valuation review when appraisers noted that my lot, now recognized as demonstrably flood-resistant, had increased in value relative to comparable properties, and the same architectural committee that fined me for bare concrete formally amended the guidelines to allow protective structures with engineering justification, citing lessons learned from recent events, and I won't say I felt triumphant watching them read that clause aloud, because triumph suggests celebration, and there's nothing celebratory about neighbors hauling soaked drywall to the curb, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that preparation outlasts ridicule, that foresight doesn't need applause to be right, and on clear evenings when the river runs calm again and sunlight hits the surface like nothing ever happened, I run my hand along the smooth gray concrete and remember the laughter echoing in that clubhouse, and I remember the roar of water against the wall at dawn, and I understand now that resilience often looks excessive until the moment it becomes essential, and if there's a lesson buried beneath $2.4 million in damage, it's that nature doesn't negotiate with bylaws, that risk ignored is not risk erased, and that sometimes the difference between ruin and security is a line of concrete you're willing to defend even when everyone else calls it ugly.